Did You Know Southwestern Montana is a podcast that covers the history of southwestern Montana. Today, Wally and Jeremy talk with author Glen Larum and the lasting impact Dillon radio station founder Burt Oliphant had on both Wally and Glen as they worked for him in their early years of radio. We hope you enjoy today's show.
Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Did You Know Southwestern Montana? I'm Wally Felt, along with my co-host and our show's producer, Jeremy Crawford.
How's it going, Wally?
Good, Jeremy. And we have on the phone one of my favorite people in the whole world, a gentleman who not only helped form my radio days way back when, but also was in on fine-tuning my writing and continues to be my mentor in writing as time goes on. He's a published author of his own, has 3 books published. He has a work of fiction. He has a memoir, and he has a great book of cowboy. Well, I guess it's not cowboy poetry. It's more just great Montana poetry. Native of Montana by way of Malta and Charlotte, and I'm talking about Glen Larum, who now calls home in Austin, Texas, where he was involved in the newspaper business and public relations for the state of Texas for many, many years. And he is recovered from that nasty storm that went through Texas because Austin was right in the heart of it. And good afternoon, Glen. How are you doing today?
Well, that about sums it up, Wally.
Oh, we haven't even.
Last week was reminded me of Montana. Reminds me of why I live in Texas. Well, I never thought that I'd be referring to the winter of 21 as that hard winter of 21 being 2021.
Yeah.
But, yeah. No, I survived.
Well, that's good. And your bride, Pat, did she make it through in flying colors too?
Likewise. I don't think I could have made it without her.
Okay. Well, Glenn, the subject of our, as you know, and I'll say to our audience, the subject of our Did You Know Southwestern Montana today is KDBM Radio. We sadly lost the father of KDBM Radio a couple of weeks ago. Burt Oliphant passed away, but he touched so many people's lives that were involved in radio over the years, and we are going to share some radio experiences from the early days of KDBM. KDBM January 1st, 1957. I started my tenure in 1969, but Glenn, you were there a couple years earlier than that, so you've got stories that I maybe haven't heard yet.
It's possible. You know, the first time I ever saw Burt Oliphant, I'd heard his voice on the radio. If you lived in Dillon, couldn't escape that. But a friend of mine was going out to the radio station to interview for an announcer's job, and I was sitting in the TV room at the college dorm, and he came through and said, "Hey, you want to take a walk with me?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" On such a short, simple sentence, your whole life can hinge. I said, okay, and we started a 4-mile walk out to the radio station there north of let's say the Club Royal. I'll pick a familiar landmark in those days. And while Fred was in talking to Burt, who was in the main studio, I was in the production room talking to Lee Barker, who was the professional announcer at the station at the time. He'd come to work there in 1966, and that was his job. He wasn't just a college student trying to find a part-time job. He was a broadcaster, wanted to be a professional announcer. So, I mean, he was somebody. And we had a nice conversation. I don't remember all of it, except that I told him, yeah, what I wanted to be was a writer. I was always saying that in those days. And Fred and I walked out of the station, hitchhiked to Butte, visited his grandma, and came back to college. And that next week, I got a phone call in the dorm from Lee Barker asking me if I'd like a job at the radio station. I mean, like, my eyes rolled up in my head, and I thought, what am I going to say to Fred? But I said to Lee, I said, sure, yeah. And so the next thing I knew, I was at the radio station, and Burt was introducing himself to me. And I said, what is it that I do? He said, well, you would just work a shift, start you out on a weekend shift. And he showed me the studio, and I looked at all the toggles and the dials and the switches and the turntables and the tape recorders and the players, and I remember thinking, wow, I'll never be able to do this. But then came the day when I could do it in my sleep. So that's how it all began. That's the first time I ever remember seeing Burt Oliphant. Now, let me bring this story full circle. The last time I ever saw Burt Oliphant, I saw both Burt and Peggy. I was working out somewhere out in the field for the Texas Department of Transportation. I came into the office, and as I came through the lobby, the lady Judy behind the receptionist desk says, "You've got 2 guests in your office." I said, "Really? Who?" She said, "Burt and Peggy Oliphant." Keep in mind, this is probably 2005, and I hadn't seen Burt since 1975. So I walked down the hall and walked in, and sitting there in front of my desk, sure enough, it was Burt Oliphant and his wife Peggy. And I sat down, and we had a great visit. And as you can guess, kind of ran the whole gamut in a few minutes of our whole history together. But I'll never forget that. I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" He said, "Well, we were traveling through Texas. We were stock in the state at night. Had to do some work on I don't know whether it was a travel trailer or an RV or what. But we saw you on TV, and we said, we've got to go see him." So they drove the 85 miles out of their way to come up to Odessa. And I had just, not too long before that, had a really neat experience related to radio. I had got to broadcast the beginning of a professional baseball game with the Texas Rangers and the Seattle Mariners, and I had put them on tape. And I happened to have one of those cassette tapes with me there in the office. And Burt said, "Do you have a tape of that?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Well, we have a cassette player in our outfit, and I'll send it back to you. We'd love to listen to that." So the last thing I remember was I handed him the tape, shook his hand, and nodded to Peggy and told them it was really wonderful to see them again. They played such an important part in my life. And then he walks out the door. But boy, all the memories that evoked at the time, it was quite a nice happenstance 30 years later to have that experience. So he was an interesting guy, I have to say that. He overlooked all of my mistakes, and believe me, when you talk about rookie mistakes, I made them all, most of them twice. And he even occasionally looked the other way when I kind of pushed the envelope on the music. He had designed a pretty tight little envelope, and I was always trying to work something in that, well, you made it clear I better not push it too far. But when I went to work there, he had a way of building you up even when you thought he was holding you back. And I appreciate that about him more as the years go by. I hadn't been there very long, and he sent me to Bozeman to be the delegate for the radio station to the Intermountain Network News Radio Convention. And then he was always pushing us to find something that the Intermountain Network News flagship station in Salt Lake, which was KELL Call Radio. Jack Bogut had worked there at one time, who was one of the early announcers at KDBM Radio. And he was always wanting us to send news pieces to IMN so that KDBM would get some publicity across the state. So I remember doing that a time or two. There's a couple of stories on that end that I've told a few places, but he was the kind of guy that encouraged all of his announcers to go as far as they wanted to in radio. And I mean, they did. Jack Bogut went on to KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was one of the great radio stations in North America. Jack Selway worked at KGO in San Francisco. Even hosted a few of the Other Room with a Hungry Eye with Ira Blue. And then went on to a great career. Lee Barker was probably the best announcer that I've ever heard on radio. And he worked in radio as long as he wanted to, and then went on to have his own kind of career doing creative things of every kind. But he had the most creative imagination of any announcer that you could ever work with.
Well, you guys had an interesting show. In fact, it was a show that could have hurt me in more ways than one. As I was up high doing some work for my grandmother or my mom, the years have gone by. I'm not sure which one, and I was listening to Town and Country. I believe that was the name of your program. And I mean, it was one of those, whatever you guys did, whatever bits you did, it was a belly laugh. And you don't want to do a belly laugh when you're on a steep roof. So I just remembered that show stands out in my memory before I got into radio as just being strictly a listener, and what a great radio show that was, and comparing it to shows, that I listened to in larger markets as I worked radio. It was a one of a kind, and the listeners out there were a wee bit on the lucky side to have that type of entertainment show in Dillon, Montana.
Well, it was a real interesting premise. It had a town guy who was very smart, sophisticated, had a dry wit, wonderful sense of humor, and for the country guy, it had this young moron. And the two played off each other perfectly. I remember the very moment that you're talking about when you were up the ladder on the roof, because we had just done a little bit, and I had said something that wasn't even meant to be funny, and Lee realized how funny it was and started laughing. And by the time I realized what he'd realized, and I got to laughing, it was just devolved into bedlam there before somebody either stuck a cassette player in with a commercial on it or put a record on or something. Otherwise, you probably would have fallen off that roof. Yeah. Well, and that was only one of the influences that got me interested in radio. I was telling Jeremy earlier today or yesterday, I was in the basement of my house listening to the radio as a senior in high school.
And whoever was on the radio was obnoxiously obnoxious. And I'm not going to say any names out loud, but I think anybody that worked in radio would probably know who I'm talking about. Was just going on, and finally I just said, geez, I can do better than that. And sure enough, I got into radio. I was originally going to go to broadcast school instead of going to college. I was going to go to a broadcast school, and we'd filled out the paperwork, and I was set to go to Minneapolis in the fall and go to a broadcast school that specialized in sports broadcasting. One of the facets, and of course, me being not the stellar athlete that other people I know, that was going to be my way to stay involved in sports. And sad to say, it didn't ever happen because the school went bankrupt and they closed all. I believe there was 4 campuses across the country, and they closed them all. And my mom, the very smart woman, she said, well, why don't you go to Western for 1 year and go out to the radio station, and maybe they'll need some help. And they did.
There's a smart woman.
Yes. She
obviously listened to the radio station and knew that we needed some help.
Well, there was always, she in later years, she said something about my education. She said, if you go back and look at it, you really, in those 4 years you were at Western, you really got 2 degrees. You got a degree in radio or in liberal studies, and you also got a degree in radio, because I worked, right when I was going to college, and she was right. I did end up with two degrees, and it was Radio 101, the real basics of radio. And I got to tell everyone about my training stories. Glenn and another fine former Dillon KDBM announcer, Don Richardson, who now owns Cattle Radio over in Miles City. They were my trainers, and they kind of intersected. Glenn was a college student too, so it was kind of in between his studying and going to classes, being editor of the newspaper. It's surprising he ever found any time to sleep. And I believe Don was another one of those guys that was strictly a radio announcer. He might have been taking a class or two, but I think his main gig was the radio station. Well, so Glenn would train me in the afternoon or on the weekends, and Don would train me early in the morning. I mean, they wanted you to learn every facet of KDBM from 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night when it signed off.
There was an ulterior motive to that. It was so that you could pull anybody's shift.
Yes. Well, my biggest memory about that, I had to play. I was working the daytime shift, and it was middle of the road. And to people that don't know middle of the road in those days, that was like Andy Williams and Doris Day and Robert Goulet and those types of artists, the Jackie Gleason Orchestra, and it was like a 2 or 3 hour shift. And I remembered Glenn said we didn't have a set format, set music. We had to play in a certain order, like you find when you get into the larger formats where you've got a playlist you have to follow. We had shelves of albums, and they were all labeled, and we had racks of 45s, 45 RPM records, which probably a lot of people say, what the heck is that? But Glenn said, well, you get to go on next, because I'd been kind of over his shoulder. And he said, what do you want to hear? And it was summertime, so I knew my mom would be listening to the radio, and I said, well, my mom really likes Robert Goulet. And he said, okay. So I go over there and I pick out, I think it was his new album was just there, and Glenn, I don't know if there's any Irish in him, but the Irish mischievousness of a leprechaun. He said, just remember, when you back sell it, it's not Goulet, it's Robert Goulet, which I had already knew that because I had said I want to play Robert Goulet, but Glenn decided he would test me. So I get on and I play Robert Goulet. So, Glenn had fun with me in the educational process. Don Richards, on the other hand, though, when I went in to work my third morning shift, he thought I had been there long enough to handle doing everything and it was mainly just, news and country music, and you'd throw in a farm report and stuff like that. And he said, "Are you ready to go?" And I said, "Yeah." And so we had the rack of spots in the order they were in. Spots is the radio commercials in the order that they were going to be played. I knew how to read the log and do that. And then he goes behind the board, which, if you remember the old KDBM, the main studio control board faced the production room. And
I slept there many times myself.
Well, yeah. He took a nap, and I was on my own. And luckily he didn't snore. It would have been really interesting. And then I learned that was kind of SOP for training early people. Is you would let them be there for 2 or 3 shifts, and then you turn it over to them, and end up sleeping for a couple hours until Burt usually rolled in about 7:30, 8 o'clock, something like that. And it was interesting. But those early days of radio, we talked about before. Burt had a try. I think this happened when you and Don were there. Is he had some kind of special tryout offer with United Press International's wire service, UPI, and he did it right up until the trial period, and they said, "No, we don't really need that. We get our national news from ABC, we get our state and regional news from IMN, and I do the local news." So UPI went away. What didn't go away was
the greatest gift of all time.
40 boxes of UPI press paper. And it was this long continuous paper because you fed it into the machine and the news would come out. Well, Burt, he came up with a certain size of it and then cut all that paper into those sizes, except I think there was 3 or 4 boxes that were the continuous length, because I think I wrote a couple of rough drafts to college papers on that long paper, but he cut it up perfectly. And if you wrote a 60-second spot, 60-second commercial, it pretty much took up that whole little piece of paper. If you wrote a 30-second commercial, you wrote half as much. And he did all his news on it, and we typed all our weather on it, everything on it. And I'm not sure. I left in 74, and I think they still had another 60 boxes of that stuff stashed somewhere.
But that almost is a kind of a euphemism for the way that he was frugal. He made everything go just as far as it possibly could. I want to back up for just a moment. Your mom said you got 2 degrees, one in liberal arts and liberal studies and the other in radio?
Yeah.
Don Richard and I gave you the 3rd degree. So
was that a graduate degree?
That's the 3rd degree from Don Richard and Glen Larum. This is a graduate degree. That's postgraduate studies.
Yeah.
Well, Burt Oliphant gave me the 4th degree. 2 or 3 occasions.
Well, I
had it coming. I'll say that.
I have my own little teaching moment from Burt Oliphant. I hadn't been, I had finally graduated from babysitting Don sleeping and learning how to pronounce Robert Goulet's name correctly. I got my very first shift on the radio station, first 2 shifts. I got them back-to-back Sundays. The first Sunday I worked from 1 until 7, which is when they signed off in those days on Sundays. And it was a hard shift. All I had to do was track record albums and see, this is the days, there's no CDs. There was cassettes, but everything was played off a phonograph record. And, you track these albums, and you couldn't stray too far away from the studio because vinyl record albums have a tendency to get scratches on them. And sometimes the needle would hit that scratch, and then you would hear the same note over and over and over and over again unless you were ready for it. So my first shift was the Sunday afternoon, which I made it through, had news and sports at the top of every hour, and that was it. Went home, and I was feeling, pretty proud. But the next Sunday, Sunday morning is an interesting type of a show because at that time, there must have been probably 4 or 5 church programs, different denominations or non-denominational church programs. And we had 2 reel-to-reel tape recorders in the control room and 2 in the production room. They had a tendency not to work when you wanted them to work, which both Glen and Don had, said, you got to be ready just in case. And they showed me, I go in the production room, which could also act as an on-air studio if it need be. And so I had everything ready to go. I had all my programs queued up, ready to go. I was ready, despite the fact I think I was working on about 5 hours of sleep, if that much, because, I was a college student. And so I put the first program on. It came on right after the sports, the Sunday, sport, ABC. I remember Lou Boda and the Wide World of Weekend Sports. And I started it, and I turned around to walk to go to the restroom, and I made it about 4 steps, and the reel-to-reel started going. So I quickly go back. One of the things they told you to get ready is always have a record on and always have either a PSA or a commercial ready to go. So I was ready. I had it gone. So I quickly went in there and took the tape that was on the other machine and replaced it with the one that needed to play and got it going again. This time I made it all the way to the restroom. And as soon as I opened up the door, that reel-to-reel went out. So this went on to both the main control room and the production room. And I don't know if it was Murphy's Law or Glen and Don had rigged something so everything was going, would really test me. But, the frustration level of an 18-year-old kid when this is happening. Now, if you're in a radio studio, when you turn the microphone on, it mutes all sound. You can't hear any sound unless you have headphones on. So I made the bad mistake of being really frustrated. And when I made my I'm sorry, we're having technical difficulties. Blah, blah, blah. I left the microphone on. And I proceeded to, show the audience exactly how many 4-letter words I knew in my vocabulary. And I think I invented a couple ones, and the phone rings. And we had the phone was underneath the left side, Glenn, left side of the control board.
Yes.
And it had
little light.
Yeah, little light, and there was a light up top that you could see too. And I saw it ringing, so and I still didn't think about my microphone and everything else, but I had the program running. So that was it. But it started going again, and I started saying, and I was letting the phone ring, and the microphone was still on, so people were still hearing my frustration. And the phone kept ringing. This is before answer machines and stuff, so it just kept ringing, and I finally picked up the phone, and I said, KDBM, may I help you? And Burt was on the other end. And he said, Wally, turn your microphone off. That's all he said. I thought my radio career was done after 2 shifts. I thought there's no way they're going to let me back into that studio again. And the next...
I think, Wally, that every one of us has that same story. Maybe not quite in the same version of yours, but Jack Selway, one time when he wrote some notes about his history at KDVM radio, he was a 16-year-old kid from Dillon who had created his own radio station in his bedroom in his basement. and then graduated from there. Won a science award, was it? Graduated from there to go to work at the radio station, and then he went on to a real successful career in radio and public relations. But he said Burt Oliphant was one of the kindest men that he had ever known. And I have an idea that behind that is a story pretty similar to yours.
Well, it was, I went out the next day, I don't know, pick up what I thought maybe it was my last paycheck or whatever. And I went out at a time of the day that I thought for sure neither Burt nor Peggy would be in the station, just to kind of see what kind of smoke was still around. Well, I picked a good time. Both Burt and Peggy were in the station still.
They probably waited for you that day.
And all Burt did was he said, if you don't mind, this next weekend, we're going to put you on Saturday night and Sunday morning again, just because, we have to juggle some stuff around. And I'm waiting for him to drop the hammer. And I said, okay, works for me. And years later, Glenn, remember when Burt started writing the story of the radio station? He contacted many of us who had worked for him over the years. And in our conversation, I asked him, I said, Burt, do you remember my first Sunday morning? And do you remember my not turning the microphone on and being very colorful in describing my frustration? He said, oh yeah, I remember that. And I said, but you kept me on. And he said, I thought you would learn a better lesson by not saying anything more than just turn your microphone on than doing anything else. I mean, he said, I could have yelled at you, I could have fired you, I could have done all these things, but would you have learned anything? And I'm thinking, what a great lesson. What a great radio lesson. What a great lesson of life. So, yeah. Burt was also a masterful engineer. Glenn, remember when the engineer came to kind of do a fine tune-up on the radio station, and he opened up the back of the board, and he looked at it, and he was kind of just shaking his head, and he turned around and he looked at, I don't know how many of us were in the studio. I don't think Burt was there, but I think it was just us announcers. And he said, you guys been off the air lately? And we're saying, man, not really. And he's just kind of shaking his head, and he puts the cover back down again. And then he goes back in the transmitter room, and you can hear him open up the back of the transmitter, because in those days, the transmitter was just in the back room. And he comes out, and he's got this weird look on his face, and I can't remember which of us or which, it was probably wasn't me, because I was one of the rookies, but everybody was just kind of looking, and the guy was just mystified how we were on the air and sounding good with our signal and everything else, and we didn't have shorts in the board except the reel-to-reels. They couldn't explain the reel-to-reels. But Burt had really done a masterful job when he went to engineering school. They must have
learned something.
Yeah, he must have done. They must have showed him the tricks of what you can do it, because the wiring and stuff in the back of the board was chewing gum, and the cellophane, the tinfoil paper that came in the gum. That's how he grounded everything. That's how everything was put together. And this guy was, and I'm thinking, he's saying, "Oh, I'm going to make a whole bunch of money repairing this." He didn't have to make any money. It sounded great. It didn't need to be, because Burt would. The good thing about that is Burt probably really upped the stock in double mint gum, because I think that was his favorite. Because he was always, and Glenn, how many times have you seen somebody on TV talking with gum in their mouth? And remember Burt's rule: I don't care if you chew gum, just not when you're on the air.
Yes.
And we didn't get to sit down very often. Remember, we had the stool that we were on, and we were supposed to stand, and you were one of the first people that I learned standing up. And you sound better when you're standing up, because your diaphragm is in the right place. And Glen was the first one, but when Burt was on the air, he never sat down. And it's I think Glen maybe subtly he taught you that about standing up, and you figured, watching him do it, because you said you admired Mr. Oliphant's voice, and you figured, well, him standing up and delivering, maybe that's why he sounded so good.
He taught me a lot of things. He was the first-class engineer of the station, and the only one. I think maybe in your day there was another first-class engineer who came to work at the radio station.
Might have been Rex Jensen, his relative.
Rex had been there and gone by the time I started. So he probably was a first-class engineer because he went to KANA in Anaconda when Burt bought that station. They bought that station in 65. But all the rest of us, we had third-class tickets, which were barely the third-class radio.
Well, you had that element. You had that element 9 that, remember, you had. I mean, the first part of that third-class license was easy to take, and then then you had to take the element 9. And I was fortunate enough to pass it on my first go, but I know there were other people that didn't pass it, and I'm not sure if they had element 9 in effect when you got your phone, your third phone.
I don't remember that they did.
So, but Bert always said about the FCC is the rules of the licensing, that because now you don't need a license. You just get a job. I think that's it. I don't think you need a broadcast third or first phone, like you did
Not
then.
to broadcast. No.
No, and we couldn't broadcast unless we had one, and we couldn't be on our own unless we had an element 9.
So back then, everybody that was on the radio had to have a certain amount of licensing.
Yeah. You had You had an FCC test that, and what Missoula was our closest, wasn't it, Glenn? Where we had to go take the test, wasn't it? Missoula we had to go to. You had to take the. You took the first.
It might have been.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It might have been Bozeman. I might have taken it as Bozeman.
Probably either one of those, because they both had campus radio stations, and the FCC used to congregate with stuff like that around a campus radio station. And also there's a lot more federal offices in Missoula and Bozeman than there are in Dillon. Dillon's the Forest Service at BLM. That's about it. So
yeah.
So
well, Burt was the first class engineer, but in the event that he wasn't there at the station and something happened that normally a first class engineer would take care of, he expected his announcers to be resourceful enough to do it. And he showed me, when we had thunderstorms, all kinds of things.
I remember those fun days.
Yeah. Well, it was easy enough to blow a fuse in that transmitter in that other room. So he took me back there one day and he brought back a long-handled screwdriver with a rubber handle on it and said, all you have to do is just pop this fuse out and then replace it and you're back on the air. And so I watched him do it. Okay, I thought I could do that. So one day, storm came up, station went down. I went back, got the screwdriver, opened the back of the transmitter, reached down to pop that fuse out, and woke up sitting with my back to the back wall, holding a screwdriver in my hand. And what had been a 12-inch shank on that screwdriver was now about 2 inches of melted metal. And fortunately, I guess it was the rubber handle. We're just getting not free.
Well,
I was still alive.
They refined that, because I remember having to change fuses, and I thought maybe it was a screwdriver. I thought it was a pliers that you just pulled the rubber-handed pliers that you just pulled the fuse out. But
maybe they did refine it.
Yeah,
I called Bruce Thomas. He came out. Took care of it. I don't know that Burt ever knew that it happened, but
well,
it taught me an invaluable lesson. I call professionals after that.
To me, it almost sounds like you guys got a lot of learning or baptism by fire, which, in a way, that's kind of the best way to learn it is,
If you survive, yeah.
Yeah, well, if you survived.
So, I had talked about my first air shift. What I didn't talk about was there was a pre-trial run before I got my own air shift. And it was a little program that ran from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, Monday through Friday, called the 1490 Request Club. And it was unorganized chaos because you were taking requests and you had to play the requests, you had to play the commercials, and it was heavily sold because a lot of people listened to it. And, well, I say a lot of people, kids listened to it. And I can remember Glenn told me when I was told I was going to finally get my 1490 Request Club debut, he said it was almost like he was writing Frank Sinatra's New York, New York, because in so many words he said, if you can do this shift, you can do any shift on this station. And I remember when I was done with it, I was wired. My eyes were probably as big around as silver dollars. This was when, if people from the 60s remember Sugar Sugar by the Archies, I must have played that stupid song 10 times in that hour because at that time it was the most popular song in the world and in Dillon, Montana, and everybody wanted to hear it. Ask your mom and dad, Jeremy. They'll remember the 1490 Request Club.
So back then, just kind of interrupt a little bit, was it just 1490 or was it both radio stations?
FM, we were
It was 1490.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had just came to the radio station a year after they switched from the 800 kilohertz on the radio dial to 1490 so that they could broadcast at night, and that was to broadcast sports events. And the reason why they couldn't do it on 800 was because 800 was a clear channel Canadian and Mexican station, and if you did that after dark, you'd be interfering with those 500,000 clear channel boomers, like Wolfman Jack and so they changed it to 1490 in 1966.
And then the FM came.
Then I came.
The FM
and then
came.
the FM came in 70.
Yeah, that's when the FM came.
And at night, is it true that the radio signal goes farther? Because I can remember somebody one time telling me.
Depending on the strength of your signal.
Okay.
So it's
1490 was a weaker signal. If it had been 800, it would have been a stronger signal.
Okay.
It was a stronger signal in the daytime too. But yeah,
well,
the further you go up the dial.
Yeah, it's like when I was learning how to be a radio announcer, a disc jockey at that time, because you really were playing discs. Yeah. Both Glenn and Don told me to listen to other stations and see how announcers back sell, front sell, do the weather, do whatever it is, and they said write it down. And I said, well, and just use their stuff. And well, they said, yeah, but it's like Glenn told me. He said one day their stuff will become your stuff because you're going to figure out how they're doing it and you're going to start doing it on your own. So, master classes sometimes copying other people's thing is not the coolest thing to do in the whole world. But in this instance, it really is. And I still have notebooks at home buried somewhere that have my notes listening. And you were talking about clear channels. One of my favorite stations to listen to was KOMA out of Oklahoma City.
And you can pick that up in Dillon.
Clear as a bell. Clear as a bell. Just like we were in downtown Oklahoma City. And
the cool thing is like you said, you'd listen to other ones, but that's giving you your foundation, which you build your brand off of.
Exactly.
So, it's just, and the thing that's blowing my mind, like how you guys had the engineers and you guys had all this stuff, in modern days, with what we have in the studio today here in front of us, we could start a radio station on air.
Well, it's like, all you need is something to well, just an MP3 player or something like that for you. But so we had cassettes, but I don't believe they were set. I don't think we'd used any cassettes for on-air stuff. All our tape stuff was reel to reel, and the carts, the things the commercials were on, were like about the size of a mini 8-track, probably about like this.
Yeah.
And you had the cart machines, and the bigger stations, like when I worked at the bigger stations, you would put the cart in, and when you made your commercial, you automatically put a tone on the end. So the top commercial would, when it was done, it would automatically start and go down. We didn't have that at KDBM, so we had to sit there with our finger on each one, and when it was over with, and all commercials are labeled. If you've ever seen a cart, it'll say so Southwest Montana News, and it'll say 1/32, and it'll have a number, which your account number is 14, so it'll have a big 14 on the front, and that's listed, and then there's an outtake, and Glenn, did we have a set number? How many of the words of the last commercial did we have to put on that outtake? Was it four or five?
I think it was a phrase. I don't remember how long. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4, depending on how well we knew it to begin with.
Yeah, and most of the time it was an address, so it was easy to remember. But jingle, if we were playing a Coca-Cola, oops,
that's okay. You can
product placement.
Yeah, you can say it.
If we had a Coca-Cola commercial,
we're not the radio.
It would say jingle out.
Yeah,
and so you would have to, and you had to pay attention. I mean, nowadays, now in radio, you can sometimes get a little lackadaisical because everything is so. It's a lot
automated.
Yeah. But in those days, you had to be careful. You had to stick right there. And if you got, it's like, and then queuing up records. You know, if anybody's ever watched the show WKRP in Cincinnati,
the Great Turkey Drop.
Yeah. It is very, very similar to actual radio at those times, except for one thing. You can't just put a turn. You can't just drop the arm and just have it be right there. We had to cue it up. And remember, Glenn, we could always tell the popular records because they had the little scratches in the front of it because you would cue it up so much. You would go roop, 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 like that.
Mm-hmm. The amazing part is I'm like listening to these stories, and it just kind of, it shows, like, because I can remember, a radio DJ was just as popular as like a TV person at the time. I'm listening to your guys' stories and the amount of work that
so many doors.
Yeah, and the amount of work that you guys would have to do to make these programs and stuff, and like how you guys were talking about the city boy and the country boy. Did you guys write out your program, or did you guys just kind of play off of one another?
I wish I could have said that we wrote our script out and we were well scripted, but we mostly winged it. And we couldn't have done that if Lee Barker hadn't been as smart as he was. He could pick up any thread and make a sweater out of it. So he had a real gift, and so many of the people that were there had their own gift in so many ways. Wally among them. It was a labor that we had been working at, really preparing for all our lives.
Well, and it's a true labor of love for you guys. I mean, I still see it today in Wally, like when he started coming in and we started doing the Did You Know Southwest, well, it was originally Did You Know Dillon, and you could just see the spark come back in Wally. And it's just like talking to you guys and, with me starting this and then seeing what you guys with Burt and like the radio station and how everything was ran, it blows my mind to think like modern day how much easier they have it. Because,
take that back one level to when Burt came to Dillon to start a radio station. True, he had some family backing from his wife's family and her brother, who was a city attorney in Dillon. But he had his own background in radio, Armed Forces radio in Korea, and he'd gone to broadcast school, and he thought he was ready to do that. But just the enormity of what was in front of him. And he just walked into it and kept walking.
Yeah.
Built that radio station, went on the air in January of 57. And in February of 57, his brother-in-law, who was his partner in Vigilante Broadcasting, was a pilot in a plane that crashed, and he was killed in the night of Pass. And Burt and Peggy were just pretty much on their own. And they took that and really created their own little radio empire, which still exists today. And to me, he just exhibited all the hallmarks of people that we designate today as some of the great generation.
And, it's amazing, too, because, like, I'm listening to this, and you guys are listing these people and how they went off to have these great careers, and to think that it all started in Dillon. And you guys, Burt taught you guys something that stuck with all you guys throughout your life to make you that successful. And to implant that into younger generations, like Wally talking about, like, how we forgot to shut the mic off. And, a good leader is somebody that knows how to teach lessons without making you feel like you're a failure. And that's what spurs you on to go. And, calling Wally and saying, "Wally, your mic's on," and hanging up, that right there was probably more powerful of a learning tool than anything else he could have did. And,
he's still telling that story. If he'd gotten fired.
Yeah. And he remembered that. He remembered that story when I talked to him. He remembered exactly when it happened. So.
Yeah, and to think, like, all this came out of little old Dillon. One guy's dream and what it, like, implanted in these people, and it just spread, and that's just, to me, that's the amazing part is, as I do stories, as I do these stories, they just kind of, they make me more proud of where I'm from. And, like, listening to you guys talk about this, to me it was just a radio station growing up. You turned it on, you listened to it. But as I'm hearing these stories, now I'm thinking, oh, that radio station, and what it did for these people, it's just amazing.
Glenn, you were on your way to...
It gave everybody an opportunity to be who they were. And, I mean, like I said before, he had a way of building you up even when you thought he was holding you back. We made minimum wage, just that. I mean, if we worked overtime, we got paid for the overtime, but we didn't get paid overtime. Yeah. We got the minimum wage, and he was, everybody that worked there said, "Well, boy, he's tight. He watches every nickel and dime." Well, I had a car and it threw a rod. And he said, "I'll co-sign a note for you if you want to buy a car." I'm like, "You what?" I mean, I came from a situation just like Burt's. My folks couldn't sign a note for me, co-sign a note to buy me a car. But he said, "I'll co-sign a note for you to buy a car." So I went down and bought a car. Paid $1,900 for a new car.
Times have changed.
Well, and Glenn, we talk about, him starting radio, being the grandfather of radio. His Beaverhead Madison Hour was probably one of the first and probably one of the best programs in the state highlighting history of southwestern Montana. I mean, you figure when he started that it had already started when you got here, hadn't it? So it had.
Yes, it had.
So he's got he started in the early 60s and leading up. So he still has access to people that were the daughters or the sons of people that were pioneers. Yeah. He gets them in the studio and he talks to them in Madison County, in Twin Bridges, in Sheridan, in Lima, in Dell, and Armstead before Armstead became the bottom of the lake, and he brought he brought all this history to light, and it's in reel to reels right now, in storage in Red Lodge at his son's place. And I'm thinking if there's any way, they don't know what kind of shape the tapes are in or whatnot, but those would be so much fun and so interesting to listen to again, because I didn't really appreciate what he was doing. And my grandmother, who had told, who's I get my history, my love of history from my grandparents on my mom's side.
She was there too with those people.
Yeah, and she said she listened to those programs, and she said these are very good. And my grandma didn't say that very often out loud, and it just kind of went in one ear and right out the other. And so, and he saw a need, and he created that need. I mean, I remember, Glenn, around the holidays, how many Christmas greetings did we cut for merchants and stuff like that? How many greetings when the Class C tournament would come to town? Because after the new high school gym was built in '68, we hosted the Class C tournament when the Class C had Ennis and Twin Bridges and Sheridan, Willow Creek, Lima, all those. They used to come here. That was where I did my first ball game.
I remember growing up, the buses would park in front of our house for Class C tournament.
Yeah, that's and Glenn, I think my first ball game that I did was with you at a Class C tournament.
I wouldn't be surprised. Burt became famous as a result of a natural event. In 1959, the Yellowstone earthquake that made Hebgen Dam.
Yeah, Quake Lake.
He was the voice that was on the scene for that earthquake. Somebody flew him into where the mountain had slid off to create the dam, and he actually had a broadcast. I don't know whether it probably wasn't live, taped, of flying over that location, but he was on all of the major news networks. I mean, national news networks, not just IMN. Well, Intermountain Network News wasn't on at that time. But CBS, ABC, NBC, all of the reports of the earthquake in Yellowstone was the voice of Burt Oliphant. So, I mean, that had to really up his game, I think, as a personage in radio, especially in Montana.
Well, they also in the same deal, they set up a line, commercial line for people that had relatives that had been in that area in the park and were missing. They set up some kind of I don't want to say a helpline, but just a phone line that people could call because they knew that Burt would find out, or Peggy would find out, or someone would find out from the radio station, and the same.
Yes, that was part of that.
And the same with when Burt wasn't around when the plane went down, when the plane hit the grain bin in Labor Day, but the radio station did the same thing then. So he kind of set a precedent of just how valuable a radio is, especially in a small town. And in those days, it was. I still, whenever I hear Booker T and the MGs, "Time Is Tight," the song "Time Is Tight," I think of the 1490 Request Club. I hear, I don't play Robert Goulet very often at home, unless I happen to hear a Christmas song. But I think of Robert Goulet. I don't think of Robert Goulet. And so yeah, radio was fun, and it was a great education for me. I learned how to be a writer. Because if you can write a 30-second ad, you can almost write anything. Right, Glenn? You told me that. I remember you saying that.
Yes.
Once. If I can sell something in 30 seconds, I can sell anything.
Well, and the genius, like how you were talking, like how he took the paper and he cut it to a certain length, and if you typed it up and it was half that paper, it was 30 seconds. If it took up all the paper, it was a 60-second. I mean, it seems like it's kind of a oddball thing, but I mean,
it worked. And I learned how to be a type. Glen and I were talking about, we learned how to type because I think most people, unless you plan on, having a profession that you need to type a lot, you forget whatever you learn when you're in. I had Evelyn Stauffer. She was my typing teacher at the high school. But you had to type. You couldn't write stuff out longhand. You had to type it out. So that helped me over the years. And when we evolved going from typewriters to computers, there's no change. It's still a keyboard. Still works the same.
Still a QWERTY keyboard. QWERTY.
Yep. Yeah. But I will.
The really neat thing about KDBM is that even as I think of it right now, it was such a magical place. We had all those records. We had access to the news and the sports and the latest baseball scores and just all kinds of characters. And there were so many interesting characters in and around the Dillon area who would make their appearance at the radio station. A guy brought me a 45 record one time. He said he'd been a federal trapper up in Alaska, and he'd written this song for this dog sled race they were going to have, and he wanted me to play it for him. And so I put it on and dropped the needle on it. And from Old Canuck to the Yukon shore, we've traveled this trail many times before. It was the song about the old Iditarod dog sled race, which was nothing then, but now it's, of course, world famous. And here was a guy who'd been there at the beginning of it, and he was living in Dillon, Montana. Well, there's stories like that. Everybody that's worked there could tell their own story. But it was a magical place. And, our station was located directly below the transmitter tower. Wally will
you're going to make me tell that story, huh?
I'll tell you this story. Once during a thunderstorm, I'm standing behind the console, like I do, and I look up to see a small blue globe about the size of maybe a small soccer ball come out of the transmitter room about 4 feet off the floor, make a 90-degree turn, go down and up the hall, take a left, and exit through the front screen door. And it just leaves a black smudge on where the dust has been on the screen. And it was just scary enough to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And I called my dad and told him what I just seen, and he said, "St. Elmo's fire. Look it up." And as I think back on my whole 4 tours of duty at KDBM Radio, and I was there 4 different times, it was just like that. I mean, it was a magical place. Lots of neat things happened and lots of great memories. And Burt was, of course, the guy who put it all in motion.
Well, my story that funny Glenn doesn't mention that this was another one of those little things that they told you about is they said, "You want to impress the girls in your life?" And I'm going, okay, what do you mean? And he said, and I can't remember if it was Glenn or Don Richards, maybe both of them. They reach up above and they pull the fluorescent light, the long light out, and they walk out and they stand next to the transmitter and it lights up in their hand. And then they go back in and very nonchalantly put it back in the lights fixture and don't say anything. And I'm sure that the grins were there. They were just trying. They were really good about not doing it. So I remember the first time I did it, I said, "I'm either going to impress her or I'm going to be electrocuted." So, but and we've been at this for quite a while, so we better wrap it up. But one thing we want to talk about really quick is there, as we talked about, Glenn alluded to all these great guys that went off into radio history somehow. I've talked to a few of them, and what we're thinking about doing is making this somewhat of a regular deal, as far as regular in the sense of once a year, and maybe do it around the time of when the radio station signed on in January of 1957, and by way of either direct phone like we have Glenn on today, or whether we do phone interviews, and then the great Jeremy engineer puts everything together and we have a program. This is fascinating stuff. Maybe not for everybody, but it's a little bit. It's all our mission statement, Jeremy, and my mission statement for the program is to teach people to remember about what Dillon has been and how it got to where it is right now. And this, Burt, very first radio station. But we talked about Jack Bogut. I brought this book in. Jack Bogut, he's now retired from KDKA Radio in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He took over for Burt when Burt went to broadcast school to get his first-class license. Jack ran the station. He had a super great career. Glenn, of course, he came back 4 different times. I just think he couldn't get radio out of his system. And he was looking for excuses, because he was very, very good. He was a good mentor to me in radio. Jack Selway, who Glenn mentioned, who had a phenomenal career. Lee Barker. When I went to broadcast school after I graduated from Western in Salt Lake City, Lee was still in Salt Lake City working radio. And I remember going to, we had to get permission for me to go in there and watch him work. And it's masterful to see someone that good work, because it kind of gets you going. Don Richards, the napper in my training session, he owns KATL Radio in Miles City. He's still involved in broadcasting. Rod Luck, who was trained by Lee Graves, he went on to a TV career, and he was back in Dillon a few years ago and told Lee that he said, radio's much better than TV. Dick Brundage, who is now in his 80s, he is still in broadcasting. So there's really no age limit. Lee Graves couldn't make it. He was disappointed. He had a shift to fill. He said, I get too bored if I sit around being retired. So he's picked up another little gig that he works. And of course, Glen Larum and myself, and the list could probably go on. It
could go on. There's no question. I mean, there's so many young college students that spent at least a portion of their collegiate career working at that radio station, and I'm sure they learned as much as we did.
Well,
tell Lee Graves, by the way, I wanted to say hi and tell him I still say that he taught me everything I know, and.
I'll do that. I'll walk down and stop into his store on the way. But, we were Glenn, you were a work study kid, because you came here on a baseball scholarship and you did work study. As you're talking about the college kids going through radio station, they had another form of work study. It was a broadcasting work study that they came through that was mentored by Burt and Peggy Oliphant. So, Jeremy, you let us do most of the talking today.
You know what? You guys had some amazing stories, and for me, it's just like kind of an honor to be sitting here listening to this past. Because, like I said, growing up, it was the radio station. Didn't really have much thought into it, and you'd see like old movies where they kind of made the radio DJs the people that you wanted to be. Being a kid of, Generation X, where everything changed from cassettes to digital, we got the best of both worlds. We got, we got the tail end of vinyl and the tail end of cassettes, and then we were introduced to CDs. And, for a long time, it's kind of funny because this really opened up my eyes to the world of radio, because I can remember like that 70s show, it's, when she was on the radio, and to her it was a big deal, and to me I was like thinking, why is that a big deal? But if you look at what you guys had to do back then, and the licensing that was put into it, and how every person on that air had to have a license, it had a lot of respect with that title. And I don't think that respect follows the title now because people don't realize what the early pioneers had to do to get that. Like you talking about going out and being able to hold a light in your hand and get it to turn on. I mean, you guys worked with a lot of power. You know, it wasn't something that you just kind of screwed around with and talking about replacing the fuse and ending up on the other side of the room. I mean, this stuff is just stuff I never even thought of when I thought of radio.
Well, and you talk to anyone who worked in radio probably late 50s into the 70s, they all have stories like that.
Yeah.
Because radio was an entirely different profession then. It's still a good medium.
It is.
It's still a good medium, but I talked to Glen, and I talked to I've got a close friend who was my program director at a station in Boise, and we still stay in contact. And he's involved in a not a commercial radio station. It's in their retirement home. Retirement community down at Sun City. They have their own radio station down there that just broadcasts in. He's actively involved in this, and he said, no matter how hard we try, we just can't get it out of our system. But you try and find the system that's close to what it was, and it's never going to be like that. And I'm glad I worked that time. I'm blessed to have worked radio at that time, because I don't think it was the golden age, because the people in the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s might disagree, because then that was when radio really turned.
It was
the corner.
all there was.
That was the, at night everybody gathered around radio. I've got those old radios in here that, are from that era, and
they're classic.
Yeah.
They're classic. So Glenn, I'm going to wrap things up. What did we have to say at the top of every hour? Because it's a little past 3:00 our time. Can you remember what we had to say at the top of every hour before we went into ABC News?
This is KDVM Radio, 1490, Dillon, Montana.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our program today on Did You Know Southwestern Montana? On behalf of Jeremy, myself, and our very special guest, Glen Larum, good day.
Good day.
I was born along the eastern bank